Okay, I think you should see the presentation now. So the topic of this presentation is ventilative cooling, a hot topic. And so basically what will be covered is 4 elements. So first of all, ventilative cooling is not a new topic. Secondly, there are now clearly new opportunities, but at the same time also new challenges. Few words about the venticool platform, which is dealing with the topic of ventilative cooling, and then to end a few conclusions. So let's start with the first one. Ventilative cooling is not a new topic, and illustrating that by, let's say, a number of projects which have been taking place over the last, let's say, 20 years. Probably one of the first was in the beginning of the 90s called Natvent. It was a European project aimed to contribute to a better understanding of the barriers, but also the possibilities for applying natural ventilation in office buildings. That you find a hyperlink where you can find more information, as will be for the next project. And so, of course, one of the key elements was there to see to what extent can night ventilation, which is a form of ventilative cooling, can night ventilation be effective for, let's say, at the same time improving thermal comfort, while at the same time keeping the energy low. Also in the 90s, there was, within the context of the International Energy Agency, called Annex 35 HybVent, which was coordinated by Heiselberg. You see the picture at the bottom, and he is also the next speaker today. And this project aimed to develop control strategies for hybrid ventilation systems, focusing on office and educational buildings, to develop methods to predict the performance of such hybrid ventilation systems, to promote energy and cost-effective hybrid ventilation systems in this kind of buildings, and finally to select suitable measurement techniques for diagnostic purposes in buildings with hybrid ventilation systems. I think another interesting project, and there are many others, but I just selected a few of them, is the RESHYVENT project, which was an EU-based project, to a certain extent quite similar scope as HybVent, but in this case focusing on residential buildings. So you see it, RESHYVENT stands for residential buildings, and also here the focus was on how can you develop smart ventilation strategies, as well for improved indoor air quality control as for an element for ventilative cooling of buildings. The other project to illustrate the attention to ventilative cooling is KEEPCOOL, middle of let's say the previous decade. European project aimed to propose intelligent ways of getting passive cooling to penetrate the market and to establish a new definition of sustainable summer comfort. Again, here you find the link for more information. And then I would say the last example of many projects is SchoolVentCool, which was, let's say, quite recently finished. Again, a European-based project to develop different high-performance renovation strategies for school buildings. So you see here focus on school buildings, but also on renovation, which of course is a key challenge for the future. And it also tried to develop new solutions for ventilation systems, natural cooling, and application of prefabricated models were also investigated. So that to illustrate that it has been a topic already for a long time. And the fact that it appeared in the 90s and early of this, let's say, of the 2000s, I think that is also linked to the fact that there has been a shift in focus, whereas still, let's say, the 80s, if we spoke about energy, it was a lot dealing with how to limit the energy demand of building, the heating demand. Indoor climate was focusing on how to keep our buildings sufficiently warm. But as you know, with respect to the energy, it has shifted from focusing on the heating demand to first focusing on the energy consumption, so including the systems for heating. And now for, I would say, more than 10 years, the focus is on primary energy consumption, including cooling, lighting, and so on. And whereas for indoor climate, I would say there is a clear shift from the issue of keeping our buildings warm to good indoor air quality, good acoustics, and then, of course, very important for the topic of today is how to guarantee that our buildings are not too hot, in particular in summer. Now, ventilative cooling is clearly, I would say, one of the parameters to play for keeping, let's say, our buildings not too hot in summer. But of course, there are other elements, and so that is illustrated here. So if you speak about the more passive techniques, basically you have, I would say, 3 elements to play with. That is thermal mass, solar control, and ventilative cooling. Each of them are important. By combining them, you can substantially, I would say, increase the impact. And just an illustration of, let's say, the impact of combining it. What you see here are monitoring results of low energy office buildings around the year 2000. So well insulated, you see good solar shading. And you see then here at the top, the dark red curve is for a 1 week period. You see that the blue line was the outdoor temperature, so towards the end it was close to 30 degrees. So you see that although very well insulated, good solar shading, that without night ventilation, the temperature was more or less increasing day by day, resulting at the end of that hot period for Belgian conditions, because probably for other countries as well, but you see quite uncomfortable temperatures. The same building with thermal mass, with solar shading, but now also night ventilation, and that you see these large louvers in the facade, but also we had large chimneys at the roof. You see by applying also night ventilation, then you obtained a much better indoor climate reflected by the green curve. So that illustrates the fact that ventilative cooling has a potential, but it has to be combined with others in order to become really effective. Now, so that I would say is the past. Today and the future we see, I think, a number of other challenges, opportunities and challenges. And if I go back to the scheme before, start first about the energy, where the last box was primary energy consumption becomes important. I think what we will see in the next five years ahead of us, that we really move now to extremely low primary energy consumption reflected by the nearly zero energy buildings. So that's in terms of the energy consumption. I would say another major driver or a challenge for the future is the whole issue of power management, whereas we have more and more renewable energies and real challenges to meet the demand and the supply. That also we think can be for ventilative cooling an opportunity. If we look now to the outdoor climate, I think there a major opportunity, and I believe that Per Heiselberg will further develop it in his presentation, is that because we move now to very well insulated with a very small heating demand, that ventilative cooling will not only be relevant for the very hot periods, but for a quite substantial time of the year. So that means the potential is growing, but in addition, as it can also be very effective during, let's say, less warm periods, the cooling potential is much larger because the outdoor temperatures are much lower. So there I think we have a real opportunity, but at the same time, as you use it more periods of the year, you will of course become more demanding about the quality of this ventilative cooling. Think of how to deal with outdoor noise, the draft problems if the outdoor air is cooler, issues like rain, burglary, fine dust. So clearly there are opportunities, but also challenges to deal with. And so just a little bit further to develop the energy challenge, I think you know this slide, so it is the European roadmap to 2050, which indicates that for, let's say, the total of Europe, the challenge is to reduce the CO2 emissions by 80%. You see it here compared with 1990. For the building sector, even of the order of 90%. Now 2050 is very far away, so it is in policy terms translated in more short-term objectives, and then typically we focus on 2020. And as you know, the Energy Performance of Building Directive, there it is translated into, let's say, the requirements that member states should impose requirements which are already in this period cost optimal, but towards 2020 the requirements should be expressed in terms of nearly zero energy buildings. So that of course put a high pressure on energy efficiency, lower heating demand, but I think also opportunities for ventilative cooling. And so that's about the energy consumption, whereas in terms of the power, there we have, let's say, as I said before, the fact of clearly a move to more renewables, wind, PV and so on, which means that you are not anymore in control of the consumption as before, and so matching the supply and the demand becomes a challenge, and there we think also ventilative cooling could play a role. In that respect, I think it's useful to mention that within the context of the International Energy Agency, a new annex, so an annex means a multi-year international collaboration project is under development. It's called, you see it here, an annex on energy flexible buildings. I will not read the whole text, just the last paragraph where you see the aim of this annex is to increase knowledge on and demonstrate that energy flexibility buildings can provide for the energy grids, and to identify critical aspects and possible solutions to manage this energy flexibility. So how can you assess buildings with respect to being flexible for let's say, the grid? And I think in that context, ventilative cooling in combination with good solar control and thermal mass can be quite valuable. If you want to know more about it, the person in charge of this project development is Ostergaard Jensen. You also find there his email address. Please contact him if you are interested or if you want to be involved in it. So this slide a little bit summarizes some of the opportunities on the left-hand side and later on some of the threats. So I think that for ventilative cooling, the fact with this move to near zero energy buildings clearly, let's say, increase the probability that one is confronted with overheating problems, and so there you can say ventilative cooling can play. Secondly, as explained before, there is potentially, let's say, a longer period over the year that ventilative cooling can be very useful, but it also means some more potential and also lower temperature, which means larger potential. It can also be an effective strategy for peak power management, which we believe for the future may be one of the key challenges, not only the consumption, but managing the required power as function of the available energy. What I think is also an opportunity is the fact that we see substantial developments towards more smart control strategies at also acceptable costs. And then overall, with respect to stimulating really high quality ventilative cooling strategies, that there is more and more attention for a performance-based approach. There are also what you can call a number of threats. One threat I see is the fact that regulations become more and more important in combination with strict requirements. I think is a good thing, but we see that in quite a number of standards and regulations, ventilative cooling is not so well covered, and so that means that it might not, let's say, be easy to take it into account. The second threat is that as we move to more and more strict compliance schemes, which on itself is very good, but if we have it not well covered in the legislation, of course, that may be a barrier for applying ventilative cooling. The fact that when moving to the near zero energy buildings, it will be quite, let's say, a challenge in technical terms, but also in cost terms to meet it. That probably once people have met, let's say, the requirement in terms of near zero energy buildings, that probably the financial means to go beyond that, in case it is not well covered by the legislation, is limited. So that is a certain threat. And then also you can say in terms of the overall design, if there is more, I would say, emphasis on indoor climate conditions with respect to the outdoor, so protection for outdoor noise, dust and so on, okay, that can also be a threat. That is a challenge to find appropriate solutions. So I show again here this triangle of, I would say, the three key elements, but with the aim to make the link to standards and legislation. Without going into detail, my impression is that with respect to thermal mass and solar control, it is relatively well covered in standards and regulations, although surely there is an area for further refinement and improvement. The situation, and it's simplified, and it's a generalized, but the situation with respect to ventilative cooling, we believe is not so good. So there is surely area for improvements with respect to standardization, and we have been in contact with SEN on that issue, and also in the framework of legislation, we think that some work is needed. So it is in that context that the venticool platform was set up in 2012 with basically three objectives. That is, first of all, to raise awareness about the potential on the one hand and the challenges of ventilative cooling on the other hand. So make people aware, yes, it has a potential, but yes, please take a number of points into account. Secondly, raise awareness about interesting approaches, because we see a number of countries' interesting approaches. So to inform people, hopefully, that then they can see what is the relevance of it in our own context. And then thirdly, identify relevant activities and also initiate relevant new actions. There is a website, you see it here, so the homepage venticool.eu. You find a lot of information on it, including, for example, a Q&A section with some information. There is a regular newsletter, so you can all include it and receive it, and we will include all the participants in the distribution list. We have also some publications, like on the left-hand side, it is a selection of papers presented at the EBC conference. And we have also within the platform a close collaboration with industry who are partnering, and you see there the partners in venticool. Also, as part of the dissemination activities, since last year we have set up an annual conference, and you see it's combined with the IBC conference. So last year it was in Athens, the first venticool conference. This year It will be in Poznan in Poland, and it will be the second Venticool conference in combination with the 35th EIA EBC conference and the 4th HybVent conference. As you can imagine, there is quite a lot of, let's say, publications existing on ventilative cooling. We work closely together in the context of EIA EBC, so the Air Infiltration and Ventilation Center, where there is Airbase. You see it in the middle, which is a database of some 19,000 publications dealing with ventilation, airtightness, and related issues, more than 7,000 PDF documents, and this is growing quite quickly. You'll find there a few hundred papers at least dealing with ventilative cooling. As I said before, one of the objectives of Venticool is to stimulate collaboration, and so in that sense we have, I would say on the one hand, stimulating the setting up of collaboration in the framework of IEA, which resulted in Annex 62 ventilative cooling, which Per Heiselberg will present. And also as part of dissemination, you see we have now a common website, Venticool IEA Annex 62, where we try to streamline the information to outside by having a common website. So I come to the conclusions very quickly. So we believe there is surely a large potential for ventilative cooling, and with the changing boundary conditions at NZEB buildings, smart grids, we think there is a growing potential. But it is clear, in order to be, let's say, sustainable and a success on longer term, there should be clear procedures for good design and control strategies. It's also clear that the role of energy regulations is strongly growing, and with this move to NZEB buildings, I think it's very important that ventilative cooling is correctly taken into account, and that's one of the areas of work. And so finally, Venticool aims with this activity to contribute to progress on qualitative ventilative cooling. So that was basically what I wanted to communicate to you. And so I referred already several times to Per Heiselberg and IEA 62. So and I think now it's the moment to give the floor to Per, that he can present what is taking place in the framework of Annex 62. Thank you for your attention.